Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Mark Jameis. I'm director of the Public Utility Research Center here at the University of Florida. We have an interesting topic to talk about today. As probably most of you know, as this pandemic has spread across the world, we've worried about people being able to stay connected to essential utility type services. And so a lot of countries, a lot of states here in the US have taken on what we'd call moratoriums against disconnecting people. That takes on several different forms. It might be that a person's bill is just forgiven. Sometimes the payment of the bill is delayed, but it's something that kind of gives the customer some time or maybe some other means for not having to pay the bill, at least not immediately. I want to talk about how that works and what some of the implications are and now how we come out of it. We're really fortunate to have today Dr. Ted Kury. Ted's a valued colleague here. He's our Director of Energy Studies at PURC. He has trained utility and regulatory professionals in about 150 countries. He's also trained people in the World Bank, USAID, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, people from all kinds of different international organizations. He's been with the Energy Authority here in Florida and also SVBK Consulting Group. He's been featured on CNN, Fox News, NPR, and in the Wall Street Journal. And that's on a different topic, but that's all about storm preparation largely. So be watching for those things to come out too. But Ted, let's jump right into today's topic. So I set up kind of what the issue is, but now we've been in this for a few months. How do utilities, how do regulators know when it's time to start lifting these moratoria that they've been having?
I'm going to start with what might admittedly look like I'm dodging the question, but it's got important implications for how we're going to go about answering that. You know, the classic economist answer is that you stop doing something when the costs of the program exceed the benefits. So, that's the textbook economics answer. The challenge is how you quantify those costs and how you think about those benefits can be very different from one jurisdiction to another. So for example, here in the United States, all of our states have put a moratorium of some sort in place, whether it's voluntary or whether it's from the regulator, from a government order, something. And some of them have started to roll off, but you've got somebody like California, for example, that has stated that they're not even going to talk about rolling off the moratorium until 2021. You've got a number of other states that are rolling off in the fall, some that just rolled off in July. And the countries around the world are in similar situations. You've got some that have ended these moratoria, others that are looking at it at some point, and then others that are putting it off further. But what's critical in all of these decisions is tracking the costs and then coming up with some methodology for evaluating what is the benefits to the consumer.
So when you think about that, well, this is an opportunity for different jurisdictions, different countries, different states to learn from each other. So if a state or a country has lifted or is beginning to lift the moratoria, what kind of data should they be gathering so they can kind of monitor what is the impact? Am I doing it too fast, too slow? I can share with other jurisdictions and they can learn from me. How do you go about tracking and knowing what the impact of lifting is?
Yeah, I mean, even here in the United States, where we kind of have a reputation for our data gathering processes, there's very little uniformity looking at some of these costs. So last week, the Florida Public Service Commission held a meeting where the utilities came in and talked about the amount that they've had in arrears, the number of disconnections that were avoided because of the moratorium, and then some of that is continuing going forward. But you haven't really seen any kind of centralized, this is what it's going to cost. One exception I've seen is North Carolina. North Carolina has this statewide effort. They've been gathering data on the accounts in arrears, and their report that they published the end of July, which included numbers through the end of June, put their magnitude at about $258 million for customers in North Carolina. And that represents about 7% of what their revenues normally would have been over that time period. If you extrapolate that across the United States, which is a really rough estimate, but just to give an idea of the magnitude, if you were to extrapolate the North Carolina number across the United States as a whole, you'd be looking at around $6.5 billion in arrears. And that amounts to about $40 or so for every electricity customer. And of course, not every electricity customer is in arrears, but that's the magnitude. But understanding first, what are we talking about in terms of costs? And then second, what is the benefit that is accruing to people as a result of this? How many disconnections are you avoiding? We've got some idea of that in the state of Florida. It was in the information that the utilities presented. But I would think that as anyone is starting to roll off these programs, taking a look at, what are the immediate consequences for customers? How many customers are now being disconnected for the system? That would be something that I would track. So, looking at the dollar amount, how much are we really talking about in arrears, and what does that mean in the broader context of the revenues that our utilities are bringing in? And then how are people being affected? Those are, I think, two critical data points in being able to address this question.
Okay, so one way of thinking about that, though, Ted, is to say, well, these utilities, they're wealthy companies, they're maybe wealthy municipalities, whatever. They've got lots of money. What's $40 per customer to them? So it just begs the question, though, what are the consequences of these financial impacts, and why should we even care?
Yeah, and that's a popular sentiment. Couple of things though that we have to consider there. Going back to the North Carolina numbers, which was interesting. A little over 70% of the folks in North Carolina are served by the larger investor-owned utilities in the state. So that's Duke Energy and that's Dominion. But what the North Carolina Utilities Commission found was that they only accounted for about 59% of the reported arrears. So most of the other utilities in North Carolina are smaller municipal utilities, cooperative utilities, so customer owned. So in those cases where the utility is owned by the city or owned by the people it serves directly, there is no outside entity, that we can, kind of push the costs on. They ultimately come to us, to the people, and the people are going to pay. And all we're really choosing is how and when. I mean, that's essentially what we're doing with this moratorium. You're saying, well, we're not paying now, but we'll pay later on. When you get into the investor-owned utilities, they're regulated entities, and they have the statutory right to recover their costs of providing service through the rates they charge. So in those cases, that money is still ultimately paid by the people. You've got a number of different strategies that are being proposed. In some cases, utilities are financing the unpaid balances for a period of time. We've had some states that are looking at securitizing, basically socializing those unpaid costs and recovering them through either a taxing mechanism or a special surcharge in electricity bills. It's still early in the process. We don't have a lot of information about how these costs are going to be recovered. But one thing we know for sure, because it's always true in this business, ultimately, it is the people who are going to pay. And that's why we should care. Okay, so you've already touched upon kind of what my
my next question I was thinking about was, and that's the strategies for trying to deal with this, because if I understand it's a very rough estimate, but $40 a customer sounds like a lot if you just try to recover it all in 1 month. What are some strategies that these different entities, co-ops, government-owned, privately owned utilities, and our regulators, what are some strategies they can use to keep from having another affordability problem because they're now trying to recover what wasn't recovered before?
Yeah, I think you start with the basic question of how important is this principle of cost causality to folks. So the basic idea behind cost causality is if someone causes a cost to be incurred, then they are ultimately responsible for the cost. If we take cost causality as an important principle, then I think that would point us more towards flexible payment programs for individual customers. So you have 3 months of arrears. Certainly, we don't expect that to be all repaid at once. People's economic circumstances are still being affected by the crisis. So, whether we stretch that out over time, maybe, low cost financing through the utility, so basically making that customer responsible, but stretching payment out over time. If, on the other hand, you're disconnecting a customer now as the moratorium roll off, well, there's no customer now to bear that burden. And I guess you can keep sending collection notices to the customer, but if they no longer depend on the utility for service, you don't have a lot of leverage to collect. So if we can't assign the cost to the people who incurred them, well, that leaves us with having everybody pay. And whether we're doing that through a special charge in the bill, whether the government is financing that and maybe implementing a tax levy of some sort, at the city level, but essentially taking that cost and passing it through to everybody on the system. So I think the type of program that you choose is going to depend a lot on whether you're holding to this principle of making this customer responsible, or you are willing to spread that cost among all of the customers or all of the citizens in a particular area. And I think how those principles play out will really drive the ultimate decision. But as I said, this is very much a work in progress everywhere this is being implemented. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how different countries resolve this question, and it'll say a lot about their priorities.
Well, let's put you in the hot seat a little bit then. Suppose that you're a regulator, and then suppose you're a utility. What would you think were the most important things in deciding, do I recover it from just the customers whose bills were forgiven? Do I spread it across? To whom do I spread it across? What do you expect a lot of regulators? How do you expect them to think about that? How do you expect utilities to think about it? Maybe they think about it the same.
Well, I think the first thing I would do is eliminate the first part of your statement, the just the. In any complicated situation, in anything that affects the system as broadly as something like this does, I don't think it's something that the regulator alone is equipped to handle. The utility alone is equipped to handle. The customers alone are equipped to handle. I really think it takes a collaborative effort, because there needs to be some sort of priority. I mean, there is no one that decides how closely we hold to cost causality, or are we willing to socialize some of these things? You need everybody involved in the dialogue. So, I don't expect everyone to think about this exactly the same, but that's why you need everybody's voice. You need the perspective of the utility. You need the perspective of the customers. You need the perspective of the government. And in a lot of countries, it's really only the regulator that has the power to bring all of those folks together. So everybody has a role here. And I think if you just try to do it with one entity or another, you're not going to get very far in the conversation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. To the audience, in just a couple of minutes, I'm going to start turning to you for questions. I've got just one more question for Ted. I see that Tom has given us a couple, so others chime in. I'll take questions in the chat for about 15 minutes, and then I'll turn things over to Sam, and she'll basically have an open mic. So you can talk with each other, talk with Ted, and try to figure out how do we sort through all of this. So just one more question from me, Ted. We've talked largely about electricity here. In an earlier Next Practices Live, we talked with the telecommunications experts, and it's different for telecoms because they're not being regulated, at least not very much. So there's not this concept of you've got a revenue requirement to make up. So they're in a different world. But what about water utilities? Do you expect things to be very different over there? And if so, how would you expect them to be different?
Yeah, well, I think water utilities are in a very similar situation to electric utilities. In the Florida Public Service Commission meeting that I mentioned, one of the presentations was by the largest water utility in Florida, and if you look through, some of their remarks, there are an awful lot of similarities, to what the electric utilities are seeing. Huge jumps in the number of accounts that are in arrears. A large number of customers that, if you look at the same time period last year, how many customers were disconnected for non-payment. In this year, that number is effectively zero. You face a lot of the same issues. Now, the one notable difference is that for most folks, this is not true in every country, in every case, but for most folks, the gross amount of the water bill tends to be less than the electricity bill. And so, if there is an affordability component, how big is this bill that I'm looking at? Sometimes water utilities are in a little bit better shape because the dollar amount is a little bit smaller. But where water utilities suffer the perception problem is, people look at water and say, water's everywhere. Water is essentially free, so why should I be paying an electricity bill? So I think there are some notable similarities between the two. I think there are situations where water utilities might face a little bit easier road in terms of implementation, but water utilities have their own complexities as well, frequently in terms of public perception.
Yeah. We've had some people from water utilities on this program, if you will, and the situations get really complicated. There are very few water systems around the world that are actually commercially viable, and this just makes matters worse. And a lot of electric utilities around the world are not commercially viable. You and I talked about this on an earlier program. The situation in Africa, for example. So some complicated things to work through. Let me turn to the chat room now. And first question is from Tom Stanton. Those of you who do not know Tom's a very thoughtful guy. At NRI, part of NARUC here in the US, that's the Association for the Utility Regulators. So he asked this question, Ted. He says, do you know of anyone who's tracking combined utilities, electric, gas, other heating, fuel, water, and wastewater, to kind of look at what this looks like when you've combined services?
Yeah, all the tracking that, with the exception of the North Carolina effort, and really they've only just released that first report the end of July, where they tried to and even in that case they didn't get responses from all of the electric utilities. They got about 80%. Which was pretty good, but they didn't get everybody. But that effort was just electric utilities. Certainly, Tom's point about this being a system-wide challenge, is a good one. As I said, the Florida workshop from last week. There were presentations by the electric utilities, by the gas utilities, and by our largest water utility, all with roughly the same message. But I haven't seen any type of comprehensive tracking. When you look at gathering the data, mostly that data is being gathered at the state level and in relatively informal processes. Now, you're starting to see a number of utilities that are actually approaching the commissions and saying, look, there's probably some information that we need to be tracking here. So I've seen a lot of petitions from utilities saying, look, we need to be, do we have permission to track this, and this? So, accounts in arrears, number of arrears, avoided disconnections, things of that nature. And utility commissions have been very quick to approve those type of measures. But at this point, one thing that we seem to be missing, at least to my eyes, is a broad scale coordinated effort. Most of these efforts seem to be just on a state-by-state basis, and in some cases the information can be pretty difficult to find. Mm-hmm. Now, it's especially notable because this was Tom's question. One thing from a policy standpoint is that NRI and NARUC have put together a terrific resource on where the different state policies regarding moratoria stand. And that database is updated on a regular basis. And so, for looking at what's happening with regard to policy, that's a great example of a centralized resource. But when it comes to dollars and cents and connections and accounts in arrears, we don't have anything else like that.
Yeah, that would be good to have, and maybe we can encourage Tom to do that. He needs another job. So we now have said nice things
Tom's
about
not
him.
busy
It's an
enough.
obligation on Tom. Start gathering in that data as well. But in the meantime, he has another question, a little bit on a different topic, more broadly, and Tom and I have talked about this before. He asked, does this kind of post-COVID, I'm not sure we're post yet, but I talk about it that way too, but I'm not sure we're there. In this kind of pandemic period, does it present a special opportunity for revising policies towards utility programs? And he lists several. Perhaps better supporting low-income consumers, generating more local jobs, improving public health, addressing climate change. He sees people talking about this, making proposals. Is this a good time for this? And if it were, which ones might rise to the top in your mind anyway, Ted?
Yeah, I mean, in a time like this, most of the efforts are spent on putting out fires. Dealing with some of the pressing constraints. How are utilities paying their workers going forward? How are they paying the fuel bills? How are they paying their parts bills? How are they making their loan payments? Things of that nature. And to me, that's the fire that we're looking at. And certainly, affordability concerns for customers and relief for customers is important, but we still have to focus on the bigger picture of keeping the lights on, keeping the gas flowing, keeping the water flowing. But any challenging time provides us with an opportunity to do things better. And if there are ways that we can streamline, support for, disadvantaged customers, I think this is a great time to be doing that. And that would certainly be pretty high up on my list of priorities. Are there more innovative ways? We always talk about, are there ways that we can help disadvantaged customers, but without creating incentives for them to, maybe behave inefficiently? And this would be a great time to look at some of those things. What are the incentives that people respond to? What are the incentives and the types of programs where we run into what we call a free rider problem? People are benefiting from the program either without doing anything or without doing anything positive or without doing anything that they wouldn't have done anyway. Looking for those opportunities is important. And I think in the time that we have, with the understanding that, what is, I don't even know how we even talk about, what post-COVID looks like, or if there is or ever is a post-COVID. But certainly any opportunity we have to improve the system, we should be doing that, but always cognizant of the fact that, kind of the fires are always going to take priority. I think that's why, the universities and institutions like NRI and, the other great institutions around the world can be particularly helpful at a time like this, because, we have the luxury of not having to worry about making sure that the utility has enough fuel, or that, all the parts are being paid for. We can sit back and we can look at some of these issues. I think it's a lot more difficult for someone who's actively fighting the fires, to be doing that. But of course, those are also the folks with the best information about it. So it's, it's always a challenge.
Well, thanks. Just for the audience, those of you that weren't able to attend or maybe have forgotten, Araceli Castaneda conducted a next practices live session with, it was Peter Swenge and Daniette, her name escapes me, I'm sorry.
Daniette Harvey.
The water utility in Jamaica. Who is it?
Daniette Harvey.
There we go. Yes, thank you. And it was on sort of this issue. It wasn't about policy issues, but it was about organizational. When you've learned something about yourself during this pandemic, do you act now when other things are going on, or do you wait? And so they had a really good discussion about that. And we'll make sure that people get links to these sessions that we've been talking about here. Okay, so one more question that I'll ask you from the chat. Then we'll see if we can get some people to interact live. Well, I'll keep reading if I need to, but if people are willing to talk directly, that'd be great. So, I noticed Tom has put a link to the NARUC database, so that's really good. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
All right, so this is from Greg Anderson. Greg asks this, Ted, said, should governments contribute to the extraordinary costs that utilities have incurred in complying with whatever the government has directed them to do during the pandemic? So not just from customers, maybe from government?
Well, but there's, yeah, there is such a, I'm usually tempted to say there's no such thing as government money. Certainly there is, there is something, such thing as government money, but remember where that money came from the people. So it's still a question of, the people are paying. And as I said before, all we're really choosing is how are they paying and when are they paying, but the people still pay. So a situation like that, you're basically looking at it is, are we holding the customers responsible for meeting these obligations, the customers themselves, or are we holding, the taxpayers as a whole responsible for meeting these obligations? And in countries where, there's only one utility serving everybody, well, then pretty much that's the same group of people. There may be some folks that are off the grid or, self-supply in some way. But for the most part, the set of customers and the set of taxpayers are roughly the same set. So, all that really changes maybe is the timing and the mechanism and the various incentives. You put it in the electricity bill, and that will probably change consumer behavior, the way they're consuming in some way. You collect that same money through taxes, it may not have the same influence on consumer behavior in the electricity sector. So certainly, there is, I think, an argument towards saying, look, if the government said you should be doing this, then the government should be contributing in some way. I can see the argument for it, but remember, it's still, regardless of whether it's through the bill or through the taxes, it's still the people paying in the end.
Yeah, so every approach has its complexities. In the end, it's basically the same group of people, may get distributed differently.
Yeah.
The mechanisms may be different. And so there's no easy answer to it. You just have to figure out, and you went through the considerations of how you figure out what might make best sense for your own situation. All right, so Sam, I'm about a minute early in doing this, but I think it's a good time to turn things over to you. I see that Jonathan Hudson is next on my list. If he'd be willing to open his mic. I see we have things from Rom, Edward Barrett as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sam, and if you'd open mics, please.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Jameson. So yeah, so I sent everyone a message in the chat for the directions on how to raise your hand if you'd like to share, but I'll just go through that now. So if you are using a desktop or a laptop, you would go to the bottom of your Zoom toolbar and you'll see the participant tab, and there is an icon that you can select, which is the hand raising icon, and that will prompt me that you would like to share. Those same directions go if you're using a tablet or a phone, and that toolbar will be at the top of your screen. So right now I'm going to go ahead and ask Jonathan. I sent him a message and he did agree to ask his question via audio. So I've asked to unmute him. Jonathan, can you hear us?
I can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'll basically read out the question I put in the chat. And this is kind of a follow-up to Greg's question. Ted, you mentioned cost causality, and I'm asking if the regulator is mandating the utility abstain from disconnecting delinquent customers, and the utility is not in a financial position to finance that consumer debt, who will finance or bear the cost in the short run? In many countries, the government's ability to provide funding is stretched due to other COVID expenses, some of which being food security.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's, I mean, ultimately the people are going to pay. Now, in the short run, sometimes, you know, there are some differences. If it's a government-owned utility, then, you know, essentially the government is, you know, the government is bearing, let's say, the opportunity cost of that capital, because the utility is still paying out the bills. It's just that, you know, the money coming in is a lot less. So there's that disconnect, and the utility has to make choices. You know, which bills are we paying? Which bills are we putting off? Are we restructuring financial agreements? And, you know, all of that costs. If it's a case where you have an investor-owned utility, then, you know, there is this, you know, outside group that's provided capital for the utility, but it's important to remember that they provide capital in exchange for a return. Moreover, it's a risk-adjusted return. So they agreed to provide capital for a return at some understood level of risk. If somehow those outside investors are now asked to bear more risk than they bargained for, then they're going to require a greater return on the investment. You know, it may not be today, it may not be in 3 months, but eventually those investors will be compensated for the increased risk they're being asked to bear, or they'll simply find some place else for their capital. So, you know, it's ultimately, yes, the people pay, but we might have some control over, you know, who's bearing or in what way they're bearing the costs in the short run. But yeah, it's a great point. You know, everybody's finances, whether it's customers, utilities, governments, you know, everybody's finding their finances stretched at this point. And, you know, there are some difficult decisions, and I don't think it's going to be the same decision everywhere, but there's going to be some difficult decisions on, you know, who we can stretch without breaking. That's a great point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it looks like we do have another question in the chat, but unfortunately they're not able to do video. So I can read the question to you, Ted, if that's okay.
Sure.
And this is from Edward Barrett. Should the regulator authorize the disconnection of customers who are not able to pay the electricity bill after the moratorium expires, regardless of them being in any special government program for funding or financial aid?
Yeah, one thing you're seeing is different deadlines or different implementations. So we've had a number of states in the U.S. that have ended the moratorium on disconnections for certain types of customers, but for customers that are on special programs, maybe in an economically vulnerable rate class, or might have other extenuating circumstances, you've seen some of those moratoria being pushed off. So you might have two different deadlines. So, for certain types of customers, the moratorium ended the end of July, but for other types of customers, that's being extended through September. This creates a bit of an enforcement challenge for policymakers, because now someone's got to decide, does this customer belong in this disadvantaged class? Because certainly you ask the customers, hey, do you want the moratorium on disconnections for you to be extended? Everyone's going to say, yeah, of course they do. So someone's got to make the decision that, yes, these customers, it's okay to disconnect them going forward, and these customers, it's not okay to disconnect them going forward. And that, I think, would be a very challenging decision to make. If you have an existing program already, certain customers qualify for this program, other customers don't, then some of that work has been done for you, but you're still left explaining why some customers are going to get disconnected if they don't pay, and other customers aren't going to get disconnected if they don't pay. And I would imagine that that would be a pretty significant communications challenge for the utility, the regulator, or the government, whoever is making those standards. So the short answer to the question is, yes, we've seen different criteria for different types of customers. But while those different criteria allow you flexibility, they allow you to do things that you might not be able to do otherwise, they're not without a cost. There's still some challenges.
Well, thanks for the answer. It's a great answer, Ted. We have here in the Dominican Republic, we had the problem right now, and I think that we are taking the heat now, the regulator, at the media, but very, very hard. We have been dealing with newspapers and all those things, and it's terrible because it creates the basis of a discrimination. You understand? You have a discrimination between customers, and you have to justify that somewhat.
Yeah, and there may be good reasons for distinguishing one group of customers from another, but as you point out, you still have to defend that. Yes. And the people who are, and there are going to be people that, either way, there are going to be people that don't like the decision that's being made. And that's why I mentioned before, it was a question that Mark asked. Dealing with a crisis like this is really difficult for any single entity within the country to do by themselves. I really think it takes a coordinated dialogue and a coordinated effort to come up with a solution that is acceptable to everyone. I don't think we're going to come up with a solution that everybody likes. I think that the best we can hope for is a solution that everyone accepts and that everyone can use in order to make decisions going forward. But I don't think we're going to come up with any answer here that makes everybody go, oh yeah, that's great. That's a terrific answer to this particular challenge that we're facing.
Yes, well, thanks.
Let me chime in just a little bit. An answer that I hear talked about, but rarely implemented, is to have any kind of assistance in paying the utility bill actually come through other types of public assistance. So if you have public assistance programs, oftentimes we'll tie prices like the telephone service. We'll tie it to, if you're receiving public assistance, you get a discount. but you could also provide some additional money through public assistance to pay the electric bill or to pay the water bill. Or maybe you get a coupon of some sort that you can give to the utility and say, you know, this gives me forgiveness for half of it, 3/4 of it, whatever that might be. Take some additional administrative hoops to jump through. So maybe it's just impossible to do in the middle of an emergency like this. But I have heard people talk about those types of solutions as well.
Yeah, and the economists, especially economists that like marginal costs and marginal revenues, you know, they like those types of transfers because it doesn't distort, or there's less of a chance that it distorts consumption. And you know, that's one thing that we're always concerned with when you're talking about assistance. You know, are you incentivizing people to behave in a way that might affect the system overall? But even if it comes from the government, people are still paying.
No free lunch.
No free lunch.
So Dr. Jameson, it doesn't look, oh, well, we do. We just have a hand raised just right now.
Did you check with Ram, Sam?
I did, yes, and he said that it had been answered, so he was okay with that. Yeah. And then it looks like we do have a hand raised from Greg Anderson, so I'm going to go ahead and ask to unmute you. Just let me know when you can hear us.
Good morning, Samantha.
Hi, good morning.
And everyone else. Unfortunately, I can't join by video. My laptop took a pandemic hit.
I thought maybe the telecom regulator was struggling and so you're not getting enough bandwidth.
That's part of the problem too. But one of the questions that I have been grappling with is I've observed that some regulators have allowed utilities to accumulate a regulatory asset and will treat this at some point in the future, whether through the rate base increase or some other mechanism. What I'm curious about, is there any guideline as to what a regulator should recognize as prudently incurred COVID-19 expenses that would be considered regulatory assets?
Yeah, it's a great question, Greg, and we're starting to. That's, I think, been behind a lot of the utilities' requests to start tracking some of this information, is to help the regulator, you know, make some of those decisions about, you know, what is a, you know, what expense did you incur, and you know, what type of detail can you put behind that. So in the various Florida utility presentations at the workshop last week, you know, the utilities were going into a bit of detail on, you know, this is the amount in arrears, and you know, we can produce that information. This is you know, some of the disconnection reconnection fees that we haven't collected because of the COVID, and they're starting to lay out what some of those costs are. Not talking in Florida, not talking about creation of regulatory assets yet, but I've seen a number of states. I haven't seen any countries, I don't believe, that are looking at the creation of regulatory assets. That gets a little tricky with some of the international financial reporting standards. But you know, in the United States, where we don't conform to IFRS, regulatory assets are a very popular way of dealing with some of these issues. And of course, you know, you create an asset then, and one of the ways to account for the recovery of that asset is to put it in a rate base, and you depreciate it over time, you know, usually 20 years, 30 years, whatever it might be. And the unrecovered balance is earns the opportunity cost of capital. So you're effectively taking the cost of these arrearage, and you are essentially assigning it to all of the rest of the customers, you know, that socialization approach. And usually the arguments for creating regulatory assets is, you're spreading it out over time, and you're spreading it out over a number of customers so that, the individual impact is a little bit less, but there's still no getting around the fact that you end up paying in some way for, customers that couldn't pay their bills. And there are some countries, some jurisdictions that, especially those that hold pretty closely to that principle of cost causality, that aren't always comfortable with that approach. There are other possibilities might be an outright securitization. So, the utility doesn't create a regulatory asset, but instead the government essentially creates a special purpose vehicle that holds this debt, whatever it happens to be, and then, issues bonds on that debt. And then, of course, the bond payments are paid by the citizens in some way. Sometimes it's through a charge on the electricity bill, sometimes it's through taxes, but you're still socializing those costs. But yeah, I think that from the regulatory standpoint, the sooner that you can get a handle on why these costs are being incurred, what the costs entail, and does this represent truly an extraordinary circumstance, the better off you're going to be. I don't think anybody was ahead of it in terms of collecting this data. As I said, I've seen very little centralized or no centralized financial data being collected. But I think it would benefit everybody, the regulator, government, utility, customers alike, that we start getting a better handle on what these costs really are.
So Sam, Skeeta raised her hand, so perhaps.
Yeah.
Her.
Okay. Skeeta, I'm going to go ahead and ask to unmute you. Just let me know when you can hear us.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And to Mark and Ted, it's so nice to be on with you guys today. Very interesting program. I just wanted to ask Ted about the whole treatment of these pandemic expenses. What is your view of using some of the special provisions that utilities have in place for disasters like hurricanes? Do you think that some of these can be used to offset this cost, and or should we not look at a pandemic as a disaster of that sort?
Yeah, I mean, I think, typically when these special charges, and I think what Skeeta is referring to is a lot of countries in the Caribbean, for that matter, the state of Florida. We have a difficult time getting, in Florida, it's impossible to get insurance for utility assets in the state that protect against natural disasters. So we essentially self-insure in the state, and a number of other countries have set up funds that everybody pays into, and then the utility can then draw on those funds in the event of a disaster. But typically there are specific criteria for what constitutes a reason to draw from these funds. So I think the first challenge that I would see is, if in your country you have specific criteria for drawing on those funds, you may have to work around those in some way. Because if anybody, objects to the funds being used in a manner in which they weren't intended, this is the type of thing that could go all the way up to the Supreme Court in your country. And, Supreme Courts tend to look at, what was written, what was agreed to, and are you conforming to that? And even if the Supreme Court supports what you did, you've still incurred a lot of costs in terms of legal fees and time at a time when we don't really have resources to spare. So that'd be my first concern is, are you even able to do that because of the rules or laws that went into place to set up that fund. The second consideration then is if you draw on that fund and then a storm comes through, now are you in a situation where you're still placing the viability of the system, the reliability, the access to service at risk? And so that's another decision that you have to make. And as I said, I mean, ultimately the people are going to pay. All we can really do is choose the manner in which they pay and the timing on when they're going to pay. So I think that, look, if the fuel bill has to be paid and your fuel supplier is going to cut you off, and that means the whole system is going to go dark, you're going to find the money to pay that fuel bill wherever you can. And, a pot of money sitting there in an account can be an awfully tempting target. But it may not be that easy. So I think it's a possibility. And certainly in a crisis, you might not worry so much about the threat of the storm when you've got a fuel supplier knocking on your door, but there's still things that we have to consider before we dip into that pot of money.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. So do you think that utilities should self-insure for events such as these, or they're too far-fetched to even consider that including that in the rate base?
Yeah, well, one thing I've said about the current crisis is that it has certainly broadened our understanding of what might go wrong. I mean, when we're doing risk management plans, we start out with this perception of how much risk do we really have? What's a plausible amount of risk? And I think this crisis has significantly changed what we feel is plausible. Now, whether it is whether it's a risk that's self-insuring that risk ultimately provides value to the customer, well, Skeeta, I think that's where the regulator gets paid the big bucks. That's something the regulator has to decide. I don't think the answer is going to be the same for everybody. And honestly, do I think we're going to start seeing a whole bunch of, pandemic contingency funds springing up around the globe? Honestly, I don't. But that doesn't mean it's not a good idea for certain countries. I just don't see it being as widespread as, say, for natural disasters.
Yeah, thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Skeeta.
So Sam Murray, Skeet, has an interesting question, actually more comment, about is this a time to implement different kinds of technologies like smart metering? If we could unmute his microphone. Sure. And just let him and Ted talk about that a little bit.
Hi, Murray. Just let us know if you can hear us.
I can hear you fine.
Thank you.
Hey, Ted.
Hey, Murray.
Yeah, it just seems to me, listening to this, and I agree wholeheartedly with your summary that ultimately it's, we who pay one way or another. It's just a question of when. But, there's tended to be resistance among utilities to, certainly in the Caribbean, where my experience is, to implement smart metering, just for the sake of smart metering. And I include pay as you go along with that. But ultimately, consumers need a lot more control over how they use power and energy. And that has been sort of highlighted here. So they don't end up getting surprised at the end of the month when they get a bill and they, have no income to pay for it. Mm-hmm. At least with those technologies, they have a chance to, really tighten down and control how much they use, so they hopefully can at least afford something. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great point. I mean, I've talked about the importance of gathering more data. And I've spoken about it primarily from the standpoint of the government, the regulator, and from the utility. But you know, your broader point of making the customers more aware is important as well. You know, customers, as you point out, you know, for a lot of folks, they're not aware of how much electricity they're using until they get that bill at the end of the month. And so if they have the opportunity for greater transparency, you know, looking at their an app on the smartphone that shows, you know, where they're consuming electricity, when, and what the consequences of that are. I think all of that is going to lead to better decisions for the customers. Now, the question then becomes, when we have the cost of deploying a new technology, is the benefit that the consumer is receiving in terms of the greater information, you know, is that benefit greater than the cost of implementing the technology? And that's where this collaborative effort comes in. Again, I don't think it's any one party that unilaterally can make that decision well. It's going to take everybody to get involved. But certainly, I think that there are definitely opportunities to increase the flow of information to the consumer so they better understand the system, they better understand their part in the system, and if they then feel that they want to change the impact they're having on the system in some way, this is an opportunity to make them more aware. You know, most of the time, we're kind of taking utility service for granted. And it seems one of the notable developments, especially with all these different policies that we're talking about, is we've made utility service more visible to consumers. And it seems like this only happens in times of crisis, and that's kind of a shame. But that's just, you know, that's just the way things work. But you know, in those terms, since people are talking about utility service and some of the impacts, I think you're right. I think this might be a better opportunity to give consumers more information, and you know, especially at a time where it's holding their interest at least more than it usually does.
Yeah, I think, and if I can just add, I think you made the point that the essentially the risks and the risk analysis, you know, this pandemic has changed how we look at risk and how we broaden that scope, and that, I think, helps to certainly enlighten the discussion between regulators, utilities, and customers as to what are the benefits associated to outweigh the costs, you know, and that, I think, as I say, is part of that whole discussion. And I agree that it's not, you know, no one party can solve this. It is, everybody needs to be involved. Thank you, guys. Great presentation, by the way.
Thanks, Kury. Francisco had a comment in the chat. I just want to call people's attention to it. As Ted and I have talked, you've heard us make the assumption that the costs for the utility eventually get covered by customers or by someone. Francisco points out, and I've heard this of situations in the Philippines before, but for the water utilities in the Philippines, these costs can't be covered by the customers or from some other source. So the owners actually do have to eat these costs in some sense. So sometimes some of our assumptions may not hold.
Well, okay, if I could just add though quickly.
Ted talked about. Go ahead, Ted.
No. So typically, then, you know, in situations like that, then, you know, that type of thing is more likely to then affect, because the money still has to come from someplace. So, you know, maybe now the utility can't do as much maintenance as they could before, or maybe they can't expand the system in ways they could before. So the people still pay, but now they might pay through reductions in quality of service. They might pay in reductions through access to service. So you're right, they may not pay through the bill, but they still bear the costs, even if it's through reliability or through access.
Right, very good, thank you. All right, I don't see any other questions, Sam. So I just wanted to thank everyone for participating. Ted, thank you for being a great colleague and providing so much information.